why don't we get started? Ashley, if you would do a roll call, please.
Sure. Meredith Knight,
Here.
David Raymond,
Here.
Chair Tom Farrell,
Here.
Mo Goyle,
Here.
Ronald Hasso,
Here.
Brooke Brown. Brooke, we still have you muted. I just want to make sure your audio's working.
Here.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. And Wallace Grainer.
Here.
Go.
All we have at the moment.
And we have at least 3 more that have told me they're going to be here, so we'll go from there. If unless there's an objection, I would like to table the discussion on the consent agenda of 2 and 3 for the minutes. I read them, but I don't. We've got a couple little things to do, and I've been asked to try to cut this as short as I can.
Feedback
today.
from
So,
somebody. I think
I'm
somebody's
gonna
mic is still
start.
on.
Pardon?
I'm
Yeah,
sorry to interrupt, Tom. We're getting a lot of feedback if someone's mic's still on.
Not sure.
Sure
But
why. I'm using the same thing I always use, but hopefully it'll straighten out. If it doesn't, I'll get on something else. Maybe I'll just cut the sound down a little bit, and that.
I don't think it was you. I think you're good now.
yeah, it sounds a lot better now. It doesn't seem like there's anyone.
Okay. Well, if it causes a problem, but I want to skip the minutes right now, and we'll come back to those if we have time. If not, I'll do them next time we come up. Okay. The item number 4 is a working session with the BK Road Subcommittee to include discussion on the front, rear, and side setback, greenbelt, impervious cover, height restrictions, and other concerns. And I'm going to attempt to go through what I believe to be the restrictions we have on commercial properties right now. Wally has talked about the 100-foot green belt. There is a 100-foot green belt. It pertains to properties that are located, I'm gonna try to read this, that are adjacent to residential properties on that. We do not have a side setback on our commercial properties. We do have a front setback, which is interestingly enough, it's 20 feet from our lot line. Now, almost all of our properties that we have a setback that's in addition to that 20 feet, which would be the TxDOT right of way. For instance, if you took a property, most of the properties have some setback. Now, there's a few that in that area from Dry Creek to Rollingwood Drive that may not have a setback from TxDOT. And I couldn't find a survey that showed where that was, but from TxDOT yet, but we've asked for that. The rest of the properties have a setback, and it's usually around 15 to 20 feet. So if you wanted to build on a piece of property currently that had a TxDOT setback, you would be basically somewhere around 40 feet back from the edge of the sidewalk that's there. So, and TxDOT does require that just for future growth that they have and for safety reasons is what they tell us. So when we gave the right of way to TxDOT for the first phase of the BK Road improvements, it did have a provision to add extra property to be a setback. So, and then the other, we do have some provisions on height, that you can have a building that you can have a 3-story building provided it's 150 feet back from any residential district. There are a few that we have one building, I believe, that is four stories. that was built in Rollingwood. It was built out of compliance with the plans, but they actually built it. And for, I guess, 10 years, 15 years, they were not allowed to occupy it until finally, I think a city council agreed to let them occupy that 4th story, since it was already there at that time. Any questions on the side setbacks or the rear setbacks or the green belts or the height limitations we have in Rollingwood? Now, this pertains to our 2 commercial zoning classifications, C1 and C2. Now, Wally, and you and I can talk about this because we were there. When the green belt was put in place, there was an expectation, I can tell you from most of the council, that there would probably be areas that would be able to be to request a variance from that 100-foot setback. So, Wally, you've indicated that your people have said, as a green belt, they do not offer the variance. You can't get a variance.
That's my understanding.
And at the time, of course, attorneys come and go, but at the time, the city attorney anticipated at that time that with a green belt, you could apply for a variance on that.
Well, I've not researched the state law on green belts since 2002. And at that point, there was let's put it a reasonable doubt that you could do a variance, because the whole purpose was to make that an impervious, unused area, almost like a parkland.
It was, except that it was still owned by the developer, and as a new use came in, again, we'll have to ask, and I've actually I asked Amber not to spend our legal fees to ask that question until we had our discussion today. So I thought that was probably a prudent way to do it. So now I think that this is kind of the key phrase we want to do. We do not have any delineation between the north and side and the south side of BK's Road on our zoning ordinance and setback requirements. They're generally the same ones. So, and I will tell you, every time I've looked at changing ordinances, there's always been an issue about whether or not we had the ability to do it on a lot by lot basis without being classified as spot zoning, which is a big no-no for a city. So Brooke, you probably have dealt with some of this. Maybe David, I know you probably have also. Not asking y'all's legal opinion because we're not paying you for it. So, and you know, I know attorneys just hate to give legal opinions without deal, but we will have to ultimately get our attorney, if we do what our call was, which is to go by each property and provide a recommended use for that property on that. And I think that's where we are on that. So I'd like to open this up for discussion. I will start this by saying, I'm going to make the assumption, Wally, just bear with me, that yes, there is the path to get the variance on the greenbelt. And if there's not, then we're wasting our time on looking at things on the north side of BK's Road. So I would suggest that right now we take the position that yes, you can. And Amber, I appreciate you joining us. I was just telling them I had asked that we not spend our legal fees on determining whether we could get a variance on the greenbelt until we have a discussion on that. So, Wally?
The only suggestion I would have for a plan that we're talking about 20 years into the future is a recommendation that the greenbelt be reversed to a 100-foot setback, which gives flexibility. If they would just simply change it to a 100-foot setback, now you have the room to talk.
And we can.
A developer could come in with a decent plan that the city likes without getting caught into this thing that I think is potentially litigatable. If you're one of the property owners that said, I sure as heck don't want that thing there, it bothers me. And he proceeds to litigate on the fact that you can't do what we're talking about doing with the green belt. It's a simple solution, and it still protects the property owners with a 100-foot setback.
And that may, and I appreciate that. And that was actually one of our discussions that I was having on that, because I think you and I had some, as I recall, I couldn't remember whether it was setback or green belt. And so we will look at that. I would like to just start our discussion, and I'd like this to just be an open discussion, get everybody's opinion. But given that, as I read through the surveys, and it's very similar, some of the answers are very similar to the Pegasus answers, in that our residents do want greater opportunities to walk to commercial properties that they would use on BK's Road. So, and of course, Tom Farrell's big goal is to have a pub on BK's Road that I can wander down to and wander back from. So mine is a very simple retail request. Really don't care where it is, as long as there's a sidewalk and that I can wander back with. Anyway, let me make a suggestion to start this off with. We have two options. And Wally, I'm going to use greenbelt setbacks because that issue has to be resolved one way or the other. I could agree.
Understandable.
So let's assume that you can get a variance or a change on that. So the question is, in my mind, I started off by looking at this going, okay, do we want to say, all right, we're just going to do away with it and go back to 30 feet? And I really think that is not something that I would support. But I would support something that we started off with by saying, okay, we get a plan that addresses the causes of that. And there are some of our properties, it really doesn't make a lot of difference if it's 30 or 100 feet, because nobody can see the rear setback anyway very easily on that. And so I thought maybe we do this on a recommendation for variances that say, okay, we're going to classify these as A, B, and C. And A would be a property that would be recommended for a variance, and we don't grant the variance. They would have to go through the process, but it would be recommended because it has the ability to mitigate any of the view issues that we had from a standpoint of 30 versus 100 feet. For instance, we have some properties that are located maybe 50, 75 feet below our residential district. And when you get to those properties, you have to basically get to the lot line and look down to be able to tell whether or not that it is a 30 or 100-foot setback from a parking lot area or a building area on that, primarily a parking lot area. So that's kind of, and then B, I would have, that would be in an existing use that would be there that has shown that they're not causing a problem. And C would be ones we would not recommend because it would be detrimental to those residential areas. And the reason that I'm suggesting that, this is just my thought, and I'm not trying to tell you what to think, but the reason I thought that is, as I read through the survey questions, it was a predominance of people saying, I like Rollingwood to remain residential, walkable, and like it is today, to the most part. So anyway, that's kind of where, if we did that, we're not going to have a heavy commercial use on a lot of the properties, specifically on those on the north side. But there may be some properties that we could put some criteria together that would say, okay, from a variance standpoint, this is what we can recommend to make that variance work. Does that make sense to everybody? So I'll just do this and just open it up for discussion, and anybody that would like to jump in. If not, we'll just go around the room and I'll just kind of ask everybody their opinions on this. First of all, I guess it's to say, are there any questions about the setbacks or heights or anything else that we have on there, just to start this off? And I'm not seeing any hands, so let's start this off. Would anybody like to start off a discussion on our setbacks, and I'm counting the green belt and setback is the same thing right now. Wally, is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay, great. Would anybody like to jump in and kind of start a discussion on this? Brooke, I'm not hearing you.
I have a question, and
Yes,
I don't know the answer to it, whether any of these properties on the south side, the setback would be dependent upon whatever height restriction is ultimately adopted. In other words, if your A criteria is the property, no facility on the be seen by the adjacent residential lot, are there properties where depending on what the height restriction is would temper that recommendation? I just don't know. And
Brooke, my analysis of the code has always been that we did not address, and I can't defend this because I never thought it was correct, but we do not. Our code speaks to how close it is to one of Rolling Woods residential districts, and so the only properties that we have that are on the south side of BK's Road that are residential are 20 20 little small 0 lot line houses that are in a PUD that is not specifically zoned or residential district on that. It's a PUD. It's a residential PUD. So to answer your question as best I can, I don't know the answers specifically, but I can tell you historically, Rolling Wood has worded its setback and building code to reflect our residential districts and not the city of Austin's residential districts.
okay, well, my question was more in the sense of, would a 30-foot setback be appropriate if in all cases, regardless of whatever height limitations are adopted? In other words, let's say that the council adopted the recommendation. Do we have to tie the setback to the building height in order to accomplish the goal of ensuring that you've mitigated any view impact for adjacent residential properties? That's really my.
I see what you're saying. I understand. That would be up to us because currently our code does not have those ties that go in that I'm aware of.
Yeah. That's my only concern about the recommendation you've laid out here is, will that going from 100 to 30 solve could we kind of bust the sense of taking care of the adjacent residential property depending on what the height restriction might be?
I think that's an excellent, thank you, Brooke. I think that's great. You're exactly right. And we would have to put that kind of caveat in there. And these would be, what I'm suggesting is recommendations for a variance to that 100-foot setback. Not just giving it up, but just a recommendation to a variance. And of course, that would be an integral part of that would be the height that we had that would go in that from a view standpoint. So yes, I think that, but I think that's a good point, excellent point, as always, that comes up on that. Now, I did want to make this point, and David and I are two of the some Rolling Wood residents, I don't know how many, that are adjacent to the city of Austin and Westlake Hills. And this is from a residential standpoint, but it's also pertinent from a commercial standpoint. So if you're on the south side of Bee Cave Road, the city of Austin allows construction, I believe, David, if you remember, is it 5 feet or 10 feet from the lot line?
It is whatever the, it all depends on the neighborhood, but it's typically wherever the back utility easement is. So it's usually, it's usually 7 to 10 feet.
Okay. Well, at my house, I butt both the city of Austin and Westlake Hills. And I have a utility building that is constructed. It's not a portable, but it was built, and it's on the lot line. And it's been, I think that's actually in Westlake Hills. But my point is, if you are a commercial user on the south side of BK's Road, we may have a setback of 30 feet or 100 feet, whatever it is. But that doesn't mean that on the other side of that line, the setback is not going to be 5 or 10 feet because it belongs to the city of Austin. So I think that's, to me, that's, we try to protect our citizens with the setbacks, but adjacent cities have different criteria. And I think we should match the criteria for those adjacent cities for the setbacks that occur at that area for commercial properties, just for on that we have. Am I making sense on that? I'm kind of wandering through that, but what I'm saying is if you are a commercial owner of property on the south side of BK's Road, I think your setback should be the same as on the other side of the city limits line with the city of Austin, which may be 5 feet rather than 30 feet. So now on the north side of BK's Road, that lies within the city limits of Rolling Wood, and that's a different animal altogether on that. So am I making sense on that? But that would enable some of our properties on the south side of BK's Road to have a little more construction. There is one other restriction that I did not go over. Right now, we have a 50% impervious cover limitation on commercial properties. So now a lot of those have gotten around that to a certain degree because of PUDs or some mitigation that's possible to do. But we do have that restriction in place. And my suggestion on that is I don't think it's appropriate that we have to have it on commercial properties and not have it on residential properties. So I would suggest that we not have that. That would be my thought anyway. So keeping the discussion going, does anybody else have a thought that they'd like to put out there? I know Wally.
Can you repeat that? Were you saying that your thought is to not have the impervious on the commercial since it's not on the residential, or were you saying vice versa?
No, I think that we've looked at doing that on the residential, and it went over like a lead balloon. So I'm not one to, when we go through the commercial side and through all the replies that we got from the survey, Mo, if that's a factor, then I'm willing to look at that again. But right now, I'm saying that on our commercial side, if one of our one of our goals is to provide, and I think that's what our survey is telling me, is that we should have more walk up and walkable retail to our citizens. You're not going to have that with these restrictions that we put on there
Got it.
specifically. So
Yep.
my guess, my recommendation right now on this commercial side, which is what we're talking about today, is to eliminate the impervious cover restriction on commercial properties. So that's my feel about that. We do have we do not have a side setback, which I'm happy to say. I also would make my feeling is on the front setback is that we either greatly reduce or eliminate the front side setback on areas where there's a TxDOT right of way. Because it's going to be 15 or 20 feet from there to the, the sidewalk anyway. So I'm not sure that wouldn't give some of our commercial properties a little bit more space that they could operate in. And it appears to me that all the newer commercial construction is being pushed to the road with parking behind it anyway on retail. So. And you always want to park on the back part of a pub so that your wife can't see that you're at the pub. So very important little design feature that they have on that. So.
The only
Yes,
the
sir.
only question I would have is, I would like to see the city reduce the PUD requirement from 5 to 4.5 acres.
And I'm glad you brought that up. PUDs to me, and this is just my experience, and y'all may have different ones, but PUDs to me have a very big advantage to the city and to our residents, because on a PUD, regardless of the size, and I'm not even sure, Wally, that I wouldn't agree that we reduce the size even further or do away with the size requirement on a PUD, because a PUD, once somebody gets a PUD agreement, it specifically states what is going to be there. So we know what's there. On zoning, it's kind of a general guideline of what we will allow. But on a PUD, we know what we're going to get. And it's advantageous for the city, in my opinion, to see that. Now, it may not be for developers, frankly, on doing a PUD for, half-acre lot or something like that. I'm not sure that Amber and Ashley would like to keep up with all that paperwork, but that's still reducing the size of that, I think, makes perfectly good sense to do. And we may try to do it to where we would take 2 or 3 of our normal lots on commercial lots and say, okay, if you can put 2 or 3 of these together in a PUD, then that would be something that we could look at. And that would be certainly not 5 acres, but something less than that, Wally. So that's a good point. Excellent point. Okay.
Hey, Tom,
Yes, sir.
I have a couple thoughts real quick. On the whole 100-foot greenbelt issue, one of the issues with that is, I think on a lot of those properties on the north side, there's not 100 feet of green on any of those anyway. So it's kind of a misnomer to call them greenbelt per se anyways. And another thought I had has to do and kind of meshes with the impervious cover question. A lot of the sites, particularly on some of the smaller properties, particularly on the north side, are already, upwards of probably 75, 80% impervious cover now. And so any redevelopment of those would have to comply with the Edwards Aquifer, TCQ, Edwards Aquifer water quality rules. And since they're commercial tracts, they'd have to have water quality controls anyways. And by water quality controls, I mean, basically engineered BMPs. So you're gonna have to, put a little bit of thought into, whether you're going to allow water quality BMPs such as, either wet ponds or filtration ponds, in the setbacks, because of the drainage of a lot of those. It's going to make most sense to put them in rear setbacks anyways. So that's, something to think about. I agree with you, in terms of taking a look at doing away with the impervious cover, restrictions, that 50% impervious cover limit, mostly because, really the only reason for that would be, if there was some want or need to create a kind of a low density type look and feel, on those Bee Cave Road properties. Like it or not, Bee Caves Road is not a ranch road anymore. It's not a rural road anymore. It's become, highly urbanized. And part of it, and Tom, you and I have looked at the traffic experts and traffic studies, is whenever you have a road like Bee Caves Road that's heavily traveled, with lower density around it, it kind of has a little bit of a kind of expressway effect. Speeds tend to go up, because it feels less congested. Whenever you have more density closer to the road, on thoroughfares like that, it tends to drive speeds down. That's one of the things I continue to be, concerned about as a community is really the mobility issue with regard to MOPAC, the tendency for that to be seen more and more by the city of Austin and neighbors out to the west as a major commuter thoroughfare. And really, things like pedestrian and bike accessibility, as well as, really safety issues, especially, I know I have school age kids, and, particularly, going to riding bikes to middle school and things like that, kind of terrifies me because of the speeds on Bee Caves Road, plus also the lack of what I see is, good pedestrian and bike transportation and crossings, et cetera. I think that's one of the things that, as as redevelopment occurs, I think we can do some things, in terms of, like you've talked about, if we do away with the impervious cover, if we reduce the back setback, but really and truly take a look at the front setback and talk about, what's the rationale behind having a front setback off of Bee Caves Road anyways. Because, from my standpoint, I would like to see an incentive for redevelopment scenarios to pull buildings towards Bee Caves Road, away from a lot of our residential area, but then also, create better bike and pedestrian access to those businesses, and frankly, between those businesses. And, I'm glad, and thanks for taking a look at it. I'm glad that there is no side setbacks. And, I would like to, also propose, and you and I have talked about it, basically to allow for cross drives,
Yes.
through parking areas between commercial lots, because even if those commercial lots are owned independently of each other, if you do away with side setbacks and allow for kind of cross site cuts in between parking areas, and also, from pedestrian and bike areas, you create a little bit more of a kind of seamless retail shopping, restaurant experience, kind of between properties as well. One of the things, I would like to take a look at, and I'm kind of a big proponent of. Really, since none of those properties really have any sort of green belt per se left on the back. And I'm not opposed to taking a look at or proposing to reduce the amount of the back setback. But one of the things I'd like to explore a little bit about, if there's any way we could basically have some sort of vegetative planning requirement on the back, whatever, we decide is, 30 feet. I think is what we've talked about in the past, merely because, I think there's a lot we can do in terms of vegetative buffering, particularly encouraging the removal of invasive species and encouraging the planting of native and adaptive plants that can provide buffering and shielding and be, frankly, better for, everything from water quality to scenic appeal. But I think, Tom, you're kind of proposing that we look at the right things. And I think if we allow, and, talking to Wally and others, if we allow some flexibility in terms of how developers are able to plan their sites, I think we're going to get in a redevelopment scenario. I think we're going to get a little bit of a more positive outcome, particularly if we're willing to give on things like, impervious cover and front setbacks, moving the actual structure closer to BK's Road.
Thank you, David. And let me make sure I make my points clear. I'm thinking that on the south side of BK's Road, we could adjust the rear setbacks, because I think that's fair, given that basically if you were on the other side of the city's boundary, you could come right up to within 5 or 10 feet of the lot line. So, I don't want to penalize our properties that could be utilized as opposed to the residential. Now, that said, there are residential houses back there. And most of these properties are going to have the setback that they've had for on the south side. On the north side, I think it would be prudent to keep the 100-foot setback, but give some guidelines as to what positive variance we would do with a variance and what it would take to do that. And now I do think David, on the front setback, one of the key phrases, and that this is a key thing, is everybody wants to reduce traffic speeds on BKs and on our residential streets. And every study that we've done says the best way to reduce speed limits is by narrowing the visual width of a roadway. And by having properties being built closer to the roadway, it makes a roadway look narrower, and it does slow down traffic. At least the studies say that. I don't know if it does or not. So I think that's a pretty good analysis on that. I'd like to try to give you some of the issues that we've had, that I've faced over the years in regard to commercial properties that abut residential properties. And let's start with great developers. They've been, I will tell you, they've been great to work with. They went way above what they were required to do to help us on things. And that is the Rollingwood Town Center on that. And the issue was not the buildings, but the parking garages and the lights. So we faced the parking garage issue because of the lighting that comes out of the parking garage. You're required to have lighting in parking garages, pretty much all the time. And cars, when they pull in, have a tendency to throw their headlights into the residential area if you're not careful. So we were able to resolve that by screens that went on the outside of the parking garages that were blended into the, camouflaged into the green belt, so that, and I think that was a fairly successful approach. But regardless of where we allow any new development, we need to be very cognizant that the parking lot lighting or parking garages can be very detrimental to our neighbors around these developments. And you know, the lights can be turned down, aimed down. They can be redirected, but they're still going to have an effect, or at least the experience that we've had is that they've had an effect on that. The other one I will pass along is any use we do with restaurants, we're going to have some odors, and we've discussed that in the past. And there we just have to have great scrubbing methods on the exhaust deal. And I know the city has some requirements on that, but I think a recommendation that I would be happy to make would be that we up those to the current standards that has to occur on that, because I think the current standards are pretty successful on keeping that odors from the restaurant from getting out. So anyway, I don't think our code currently has those type of deals on that. So what do y'all think about the front setback requirements, about reducing that or even eliminating them where there is sufficient frontage of TxDOT areas? Let me just ask everybody what their opinion is on that. Anybody have one? Mo?
I'll just throw my my idea in. I agree with you, David and Tom, that I think given there is a significant TxDOT right away, it doesn't make sense to have a front setback. And I would support that and doing away with the impervious cover requirements. Right. I think that will lead us to get where we're trying to get with this process. Right. And so that's my opinion.
Excellent. Brooke, what do you think? You've had these dragons for a long time.
I don't have an issue with reducing the front setback, but I need to study the impervious cover issue. For example, what does that do to the volume of water going through the Edgegrove crossing? Yeah. What does that do? Does our drainage study show any impact from water from the commercial sector coming into the neighborhood? I want to look at that study, the drainage study again, and consider that issue more carefully.
I would say this.
I don't think ought to, you know, you've raised the issue, well, shouldn't the commercial property have the same ability to use its property as a residential owner has? Well, in my mind, the commercial property will make a profit, or they wouldn't be doing the development, and right. They can afford to carry the cost of the drainage that results from their building. So I wouldn't want to say just eliminate impervious cover. Yeah. But I really want to look at the drainage study first and see what the issues are there and give more thought to what kind of cost we may be creating in drainage problems for the city if we reduce the impervious cover requirement.
Right. The only reason that I was suggesting that is, number one, is that most of these properties that are adjacent to the creek, are really adjacent to it, that drain directly to it, already exceed the 50% because they were either grandfathered or they had some type of, there were some mitigation plans that people used. I don't think they were reasonably successful, but they did do that. And then I think David was talking about water quality or water maybe even water detention that we could, that'd be a way to do that. But Brooke, that's an excellent suggestion. Thank you.
And Tom, a lot of those properties in Brook also, a lot of those properties were built before the TCQ Edwards rules came out. And so really is, even if you do away with impervious cover under the TCQ Edwards rules that apply to commercial properties, they're going to have to deal with stormwater, both quantity and quantity coming off the site, such that really for a lot of those properties, you're going to see even if they stated the exact same impervious cover, say it's 70% impervious cover on a lot of those properties, even if they stated the exact same impervious cover, you would have, under a redevelopment scenario, under compliance with the TCQ Edwards rules, you'd have a net benefit because of the requirement to have engineered water quality BMPs that would address both the quality, water quality, but also the water quantity coming off of those commercial properties.
David, and I don't know the answer to this, who enforces that? I mean, if a property meets TCEQ, but it still creates a drainage problem for the city of Rollingwood, or it doesn't meet TCEQ standards, who enforces that?
Well, under TCEQ, basically TCEQ has stepped down authority from EPA for the stormwater issues. So TCEQ would be enforcing that. Also, there's under the Edwards rules, they have to go through the Edwards Aquifer working group over at TCEQ and submit all their plans for the development, all the engineering, et cetera, and get that all approved and certified by TCEQ as to water quantity. I absolutely would agree also that as part of the development process, they'd be working not only with the TCEQ under the Edwards rules, but also with the city engineers. You have a little bit of a belt and suspenders approach on it, because you have TCEQ, water quality, water quantity, but you also have city engineering in terms of drainage issues too, to make sure that we're actually getting a net benefit. And I see the ability, because of the requirement for most all these sites to have some sort of water quality BMPs, it's going to reduce or at least slow down the flows to be able to hopefully address some of the drainage issues under redevelopment scenario.
Well, I would like a further analysis of that. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I want to make sure that the city isn't impacted negatively. Sure. Residential areas aren't negatively impacted if we go to a reduced impervious cover requirement. For example, does the city say, this is what the impervious cover requirement is, so long as the permit holder, the property owner, is in compliance with all of these regulations that you're citing, for example? And that would give the city the opportunity to also challenge that commercial property owner if that's not done.
Right. And we do have drainage regulations in place. It's called the Drainage Criteria Manual, and all development has to comply with that. And basically what it states is that you can't make the drainage any worse than what it was prior to your development. And all of the drainage that you do as part of your development, you have to deal with on your property. So you can't negatively impact your downstream owners, and that's part of your building permit process.
Does that apply to commercial uses? So also,
yes,
it does.
Well, maybe we can look at that issue with all of that tied together.
Yeah, I think, Brooke, thank you. I appreciate where you're coming from. I don't want to we want development to pay for itself. That's the bottom line.
Well, and also I would add on, Brooke, and say that, my hope would be, especially with the additional TCEQ Edwards requirements. My hope that any development that occurs on that commercial side is going to, any redevelopment that occurs is going to result in a net benefit and increased water quality protections, as well as, you know, slowing down the rate of runoff. Because, you know, what Amber said is important. I mean, basically, it assumes to an extent, you know, kind of in a redevelopment scenario, you know, the baseline is the status quo. But I think there's, because of the requirements of the Edwards aquifer protection rules, we're actually going to see, even if the impervious cover stays the same, because of engineered water quality BMPs, you're going to see actually a benefit to both drainage and water quality. But I think that's one of the things, you know, we ought to be looking at, making sure of.
You know, I will tell you, the 50% impervious cover predates me, so I don't know how long it is. Since it predates me, it probably was chiseled on a stone tablet somewhere in a cave. But that's I know that I'd be willing to bet that 50% impervious cover dealt mostly with septic systems as opposed to and did not deal with water quantity or quality, because back in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s, that just wasn't a factor that people considered as a city, and even 90s. Until it came up, until we were having problems with the drainage. But I think that is and I'm not discounting that we should have impervious cover on residential, Brooke. I'm just saying that if we, you know, if our commercial projects are in competition with our neighboring cities. Now, Austin has a larger impervious cover, and Westlake Hills has one, but our properties are so small that does have an impact on it. And David is correct. I assumed from starting this discussion, Brooke, that we would put the drainage criteria manual and the TCQ and Barton Creek rules on that, so that we would anticipate that we would have better water quality and less quantity hitting our drainage.
And
So,
David, you're saying that any redevelopment of any one of these commercial lots would trigger the TCEQ and Edwards aquifer requirements?
Yeah, any redevelopment that would.
There's no size limitation, no exclusion for small properties?
there are exclusions, and that you can go into a regional drainage and detention facility. For instance, if TxDOT were to actually go in and do the rest of BK's Road, they are required to comply with those same rules that we are with water quality and detention. And if a property owner, i.e. Wally Grainer, was adjacent to that and wanted to be a part of that, they can size it to make sure that it takes care of him when they do that. And you
But
can
you
do it upstream also.
You'd still have to go through the TCEQ
You gotta go through
approval process to make sure that there's capacity in that regional collection, and that your water is going there and it's being accounted for, your stormwater runoffs going there being accounted for, and there's capacity in that regional collection center to deal with that on a site by site basis.
Right. Wally, you had a comment.
Yeah, just a question. At the time that we were talking back in 2000 of the widening of bee caves in front of the Palisades, the TxDOT was concerned about having a detention pond and asked me to work with them about putting one adjacent to Dry Creek. My question really jumps up about something strange. Where's the detention pond where all the asphalt they stuck in Westlake Hills, dumping water down Bee Caves Road and down Eanes Creek? I don't remember them building a detention pond anywhere.
Okay, that's a good point, Wally. I don't know either.
And my rudimentary understanding of the way that they dealt with water quality on that expansion is that's why you have those long grass line swales on either side of the road before the setback, because those are actually working in and of themselves, or designed to work in and of themselves as kind of vegetated filtration ponds going down to the collection system. Whether or not those work, I question at times, and every time I see a AT&T truck down in there, kind of rutting it up, I kind of roll my eyes and question how effective it is. But my understanding is, instead of having kind of one big regional collection pond, that's what they tried to do with that approach there.
I don't know exactly the numbers, but if you move water in a drainage ditch at a certain drop in elevation in so many feet, the penetration is really pretty small.
Correct. Well,
Wally, and I'll be honest, I hadn't thought about it, but I do know where Rolling Woods is. TxDOT did build one for us, and I know where it is. So let me and Brooke, we'll make a caveat on that and kind of research that issue a little bit further. But I appreciate your protecting our city on our pocketbook.
Well, and, the more I think about it, I've been here long enough to see Bee Caves Road washed out twice in front of the car wash, or on where Dry Creek comes across there. And that water just gets faster and deeper as time goes by. So
most of that water comes from upstream, City of Austin, Travis County. Some of it, of course, does come from Rolling Wood, but most of it is that comes all the way up to Westlake High.
It goes beyond that, Tom. It goes back up into that valley that's off to the left as you go up towards Redbud. The road, I think, I can't remember the name of the road. It goes off to the south. There's quite a valley in there.
Yeah. So,
Tom, this is Ryan.
Yes, sir, Ryan.
I was just going to say that I like Brooke. I 100% agree that we should eliminate front setbacks. I don't think they serve any purpose for us at all. In fact, I think they serve a negative purpose at this point for what we have in mind for the future of the city. But I don't know enough to feel comfortable eliminating impervious cover requirements, especially given how many neighbors have told me they're highly concerned with the lack of impervious cover requirements in Rolling Wood.
Okay. I would, we'll tread lightly on that one, because I think that is a big issue.
One of the things that I think we need to talk about, though, is what is in people's minds, what is the purpose of impervious cover requirements? Is it to limit the amount of payment, or is it because impervious cover is not a straight line trade-off with drainage? And I think that's one thing that people automatically assume is that, well, if we reduce or if we reduce the amount of impervious cover, we're automatically going to get better drainage issues. And that's not always the case, particularly with shallow clay soils and slopes. And so you have to be a little bit careful as to what your intended purpose for limitation of impervious cover is. If it's to try to improve drainage or improve water quality, it's not always a straight line trade-off. If it's to just reduce the amount of pavement and urbanization, then that's a different discussion.
To David's point, I've always considered impervious cover to be trying to, keep at bay the concrete jungle and not associated with drainage.
Yeah.
They're linked to most people because they're obvious. One impacts the other, but I view I don't know why, but I always thought the cities have impervious cover more for just to keep something green around.
That's right.
And that's I think that's an excellent deal. If we were going to look at something like our little draft that was done of a retail center that had kind of local retail that extended beyond one lot. You could do that if you had some type of, if you counted, of course you do count the setbacks at the rear into your impervious cover calculations. So most of those are there. The only difference that I would say is today, if somebody wanted to develop a piece of property and they had to comply with, regardless of what we do, they still have to comply with the Barton Edwards Aquifer conservation rules as well as TCQ rules. So they have to comply with those, period. And our drainage criteria manual, because that's already in the ordinance. So if you do that today, and you have the rear setback of 100 feet, now it does not allow you to put that water quality issue in that 100-foot setback. And does anybody have any opinion about that? Whether we would think about how we would do that. My only concern is I've seen some that look they're landscaped and they look great. And then I've seen some that look like bunkers that I would hate to have adjacent to our residential properties.
Tom, are you saying that when you say that the facility is in the setback, you mean some kind of swell or some kind of pond in the setback? I'm not quite sure what you're saying there.
Well, currently right now we have 100-foot setback on our properties on the rear. Today, you could not put that water quality feature in that 100-foot setback.
By water quality feature, you mean the swell or?
Well, whatever is designed, because remember, you're going to have to, whoever does what, they're going to have to comply with the TCQ and aquifer rules, as well as rolling wood rules. And our existing drainage criteria manual has an impact on what they can do also. So they're going to have some type of drainage feature there for both water quality and quantity on that site. Whatever we approve, doesn't matter. They're still going to have that because that's above our bandwidth. So the question is, do we allow that, or I hadn't given enough thought to it to have a thought on it. Would we allow that to be in the 100-foot on the rear setback, whether it be 30 feet or 100 feet or whatever it is? And that's a question that I really hadn't given enough thought to it to know, except I've seen them both ways, where they're really looking industrial bunker style, and then they look where they are a landscape feature that really looks pretty good. And now we do have a buffering requirement between our commercial and residential that requires them to either put a fence up or a vegetative barrier. And that's been on our ordinance list for, I think, a long time, probably 20 some years, 20 years anyway. So, that's there. But what are y'all's thoughts on that? And of course, my answer is, well, I guess if I looked at it, I could tell you whether I wanted to see it there or not. If it was an industrial looking bunker, concrete structure, I'm not sure I'd be happy with it. If it was a landscape feature, I think I probably, could live with it. So, I mean, that's just my thought. So, well, let's talk about the impervious cover issues we have on that. Obviously, we've got two issues there. One, of course, is the drainage, which I'm assuming is going to be taken care of by both TCQ, the Edwards rules, and the Rolling Wood criteria manual. So then we get to the other issue is whether we want to have that much of a dense development. And Mo, this goes back to your comment that impervious cover was used to break up and have more green area on that. And I would prefer, I do not want a Burnett Road style development on BK's Road. I would not personally be in favor of that. And that is where you have 100% impervious cover on that. I do want to give our developers as much of an opportunity to develop as they can, provided they're doing, a use that we prefer. But I really don't want to see this thing. Right today, we could have these properties under our existing code. They could be built lot to lot, from the side to the side, not from the front to the back, but from the side to the side, because we don't have any side setbacks. I think I'm right, aren't I, Amber? We don't have side setbacks on commercial properties? Do you know? Just don't.
No, offhand.
Okay. So I think that is correct, but I'll confirm that.
Tom, on that one, I would really like the chance to see the survey results before
Sure.
making a call on it.
Yeah, we can get those to you. So, and we'll. So we can, I think it seems like we have an agreement at least on the front setback. There's some discussion on the impervious cover. So how do we address the rear setback? Any thoughts on that from anybody?
Wait, isn't that the one that would require the variance, the green belt?
Well, that would be my feel, except do we want to look at these as separate deals and say, okay, if you're adjacent to the city of Austin, you fall under their setback rules, and just their setback rules are basically 10 feet. I'm not in favor of that, but I'm just saying that is a possibility on that. That would be on the south side of BK's Road. On the north side of BK's Road, it is located within the adjacent to a residential district. And again, our code, the way I read it, is we address a residential district as being a Rollingwood residential district, not a City of Austin residential district.
Tom, this is Ryan again. Is the 100-foot setback that was established when the town center went in, do we know whether or not that applies to properties on the south side of BK's Road?
It does.
Aren't all of those properties probably in violation of it?
They were all built prior to, with the exception of the PUD, they were built prior to that going in.
Basically, everything on BK's Road on the north side violates it because it's an ex post facto law.
Yeah.
After the fact.
I guess my thoughts on the setback are that maybe that's the type of thing where instead of encouraging the city council to have variances, we could put together a list of criteria that we think should be considered, or maybe even objective criteria that would determine whether or not we think that a particular setback would or would not be harmful to the community. I'm mindful of spot zoning a little, in the sense that, but as I understand spot zoning, and I'm sure David understands that way better than I do, but as I understand spot zoning, it's perfectly fine to have different zoning for different properties. But what's not okay is to have different zoning for like properties. In other words, what you can't do is kind of favor your buddy who has the exact same type of property as the one next to him. And if you, but if there are different
Criteria.
Yeah, if they're different factor, if two properties are not like, And in other words, one of them is right next to a residential property and one of them's not, you can have different zoning for those two properties. That's not a problem because they're not like properties. So it seems to me that maybe this is the type of thing where we could take a hard look at each property, determine based on elevation, proximity to residential home, surrounding circumstances, whether it be next to a commercial or not next to a commercial. Those are the type of things that I think maybe could go into whether or not we would be opposed to changing the setbacks. I would definitely oppose we're just going to remove the setbacks and make them 30 from 100. But what I wouldn't be opposed to at all is a meaningful process where we looked at the lot, we looked at the impact on the neighbors, and we came up with some objective rules for why we believed that in X, Y, and Z circumstances, it would be all right. I think that would help the city defeat any spot zoning accusation. What we can't do is prefer one property because we like the property owner. Or, I just think we need to try to be as objective as possible, try to protect the residents as much as possible, but open ourselves up to places where we can allow more development, or at least encourage more development.
Okay,
Tom, I'd like to point out something.
sure.
If anybody would like, I'll be happy to give you a tour. The Palisades Buildings were built when a cut was made in the embankment that was a sloping lot. The first building, Building A, is a 2-story building. The peak of the roof is about the level of the floor of first floor houses behind me. And the main barrier they have to a view is the 8-foot fence that has been installed, requirement by code. The next building, it's even less and less. And the fourth building down is a 3-story building that had to have a foot cut off the height of the ceiling in the top floor because of the 35, I think it put 35 or 37 foot.
Yes.
And the ceiling of that, or the roof line of that building, is probably at least 12 feet below the first floor level of the house behind it. It had no reason at all for any kind of a limitation of 35 feet. So when you start putting in arbitrary requirements, 100-foot setbacks, all of this, you've got to look at the topography and see if you're really protecting anybody or you're just harming somebody. And in the case of the builders of the Palisades,
I
they
agree.
were really constrained by this.
I agree. And I agree, Wally, with you and with Ryan, that we look at each individual properties and make but I like the criteria. That's what I was thinking, that we come up with a criteria that generally protects our residents, but gives absolutely protects our residents, but generally gives some latitude to the commercial buildings to let them get a variance on that. So, and Wally, that would fall within your PUD request, because
Yes.
on PUD, you have a different set of criteria that you go with on that.
But the 30-foot setback also, in my condition of the Palisades, the 30-foot setback doesn't bother the people behind me because I'm sitting below a cliff that they have the view above it no matter what. So the 30-foot setback was not a harm to the people behind because the grading brought the building down below the level of their first floor.
Thank you, Wally.
And one other thing we may want to look at, Tom, is basically, and I think it'd be pretty easy to look at, is basically what is the as-built setback on all those properties right now anyways, because, I think the as-built setback, is going to be, in most cases, much less than 100 feet. So basically it's the 100 feet, it's really the greenbelt's a misnomer. 100-foot setback is basically going to be only applied under a redevelopment scenario. And we're not dealing with, raw land properties, for most cases, save one. that, where you'd be actually saving a 100-foot swath of vegetation.
And
David, this is Ryan. Can I ask you a question about that? Can a developer develop, there are several of our lots that honestly are mostly consumed by the creek bed.
Right.
Some of those are developed on the south side of the creek bed, but they don't ever come into the creek bed. Some of them are completely undeveloped, and I don't know how they could ever develop without interfering with the creek bed. And then we have that one property that is literally, I'm sorry.
Are you talking about the commercial property? Sorry.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And then we have the one property, the new I Center, which is literally straddling the creek bed. I guess in modern Texas, environmental quality rules, what could they do? Can you develop in that creek bed? Can you build over it like the I Center did based on renovating an old building? Are some of those lots unbuildable because they are mostly consumed by the creek bed?
you have the option of channelizing the creek bed. It's a arduous, the opportunity to do it. I won't say you can't.
I wouldn't want to be having that conversation with the Corps of Engineers right now, which you'd have to get a 404 permit to channelize it, and you'd have to deal with the Corps, FEMA, and everything else. And I mean, you're certainly allowed legally to apply for it, but given any number of things, I think for the size of those lots, it becomes a absolute losing proposition in terms of the time, effort, and consulting fees associated with trying to get any sort of permit to either channelize any of that existing creek bed, or basically, do any sort of building down in there, including doing piers down in there, because that's going to pretty much all be waters of the U.S. In other words, jurisdictional waters for purposes of 404, the Clean Water Act.
We do have 2 404 permits in City of Rollingwood that I'm aware of. One is the Rollingwood Town Center that did a small 404, and number 2 is the City of Rollingwood.
Bridge, right?
And that was Delano Drive, that area.
Yeah.
And then we have a 404 permit on the Dry Creek that is just to the north of Edge Grove that the City of Rollingwood did. And again, I think those were fairly minor deals.
Right.
Actually, Ryan, the property that you're thinking of, actually, they had a plan that would meet compliance but they were building the building on one side of the creek that was out of the floodplain. And then there was a bridge that went across the creek, and they were going to excavate out the side of the hill and put in a parking lot right there. It wasn't a very big building, but they did have a plan that worked. I don't know what the status of it is. But it was a fairly small building, but they and I can't, I don't know whether the numbers work. I don't believe that was for rent. I think that was just going to be a single office for one company. Wally?
I'm sorry to say I have to chair another meeting, so I'm going to have to beg off from the rest of this one. Of course, would be the meeting that gets into the meat of things.
I know.
But I think
not
everybody is understanding that regulations, essentially, the more you have, the less developers come in, take a look, and want to make motions like they want to work with you to develop it. The less regulations you have, and the more ability they have to talk to people that say, well, we'd really like to see this, this, and this. You get a lot further than just, I've got a 100-foot setback, come talk to us. They've been to where they've been to the meetings, and the 100-foot setback turns out there's 4,000 people standing around saying, don't even touch that. So they've been burned. So the less regulations that we can have that are needed, as opposed to, like I said, with my height, with the Palisades, regulations there were not necessary. They had to be complied with because they were there. Thank you, everybody, and I'll
Thank
see you
you
at the
all.
next meeting.
Good.
Sorry to interrupt again. So David, just so I'm clear, is my understanding that you think most of that is not, that they couldn't today do piers over the creek, and they likely wouldn't today be able to develop the creek? And the reason I ask is I'm trying to figure out how that factors into our setback requirement for properties where the creek is in the back of the property.
Yeah, it's basically, you could, I mean, it'd be expensive, but I mean, you could, if you could build a structure that basically spanned the creek and, basically built over the creek, in theory, you could build a structure that, a little bit like the ice center, although the ice center actually has some piers down in the, within the kind of, bed and bank of Dry Creek. In theory, you could build a structure to span it. But everyone I've talked to on a kind of building developer side, because kind of just, spitballing with people, about, hey, wouldn't it be cool if, someone built a restaurant and they basically kind of, span the creek there, and that'd be kind of cool looking, et cetera. Everyone, said, the cost of doing that would just be so outrageous, it wouldn't even be, really, worth it. Now, everything changes over time, but, that's, something to look at. I don't know all of the specifics about those particular properties there. And I've always kind of considered them, because of topo and floodplain, to be largely unbuildable, but that's something I'd like to, drill into a little bit further, Ryan. And if you have any more information on any of those specific ones, I'd love to see it.
I don't. I'm just curious how that creek impacts any decision we make about setbacks, because if for a huge percent of look, the property behind me is the Chinatown. Pieces of it go pretty far back to the back of its property, and pieces of it don't go back all the way back because the creek is in the way. So the property essentially stops at the creek, regardless of how much land that owner owns on the north side of the creek. And I'm just trying to make sure that we don't shoot ourselves in the foot by saying, yeah, we're gonna, either that we're establishing false expectations if nobody can build these things anyway. If all we're doing is allowing bigger offices, that does not help the community that wants retail and restaurants. So I'm just trying to figure out how those play together. And I don't have any more information. That's why I'm honestly asking these questions, David, because
Brian,
way out of my practice.
Yeah, and I'm glad you are, because that's one of the things that from time to time I'll look at and, kind of wonder the same, particularly on those properties.
Ryan, one thing on that creek that we absolutely have to adhere to is we do not allow construction within the 100-year floodplain. And that floodplain was recently changed and enlarged because they had different data that they used.
That's right.
So to be honest, you can mitigate and raise it out of the floodplain. But when you do that, and Brooke, this goes to your other question that you were bringing up, or other comment you were bringing up originally. If you do that, you cannot adversely affect either the flow or the drainage area of the creek below you. You can't flood somebody else because you raise your property on that. But most of I've seen, there was a time when the Chinatown shopping center was underwater, not the parking lot. The building was underwater. And Brooke, you've seen it too.
One question, when the I Center redeveloped that building, did they not have to comply with those TCEQ requirements?
No.
Or how did that?
I don't think so, because if you don't enlarge the footprint, you don't have to comply with that. It's, if I understood correctly on the grandfathering rules. But I'll let the city address that. That's, I don't know the
Yeah.
specific facts on that.
And Tom, so I'm sitting here and I just pulled up the, so on Google Earth, I have the FEMA floodplain layers on there. And Ryan, if so, at some time I can show you how to do this, but looking at the north side, basically I can tell you that all the backside of the almost all those commercial properties on the north side there basically goes back to almost where the floodplain is. So the floodplain back there in terms of setbacks acts as a de facto setback in and of itself anyways. And then especially when you look at those properties that are in between, I guess the chevron there and the bridge that go into Bee Cave Town Center. I mean, there's virtually no buildable area on any of those that would be out of the floodplain.
David, does your floodplain map show the existing buildings?
Yes. Well, so basically I'm looking at basically a Google Earth floodplain, FEMA floodplain,
Overlay.
Hazard layer, which shows the 100-foot hazard layer for purposes of insurance.
Okay. Now you can get them out of the floodplain, but it is expensive to do, and it does create other issues downstream that you have to be very careful about, as we know about on the city. Meredith, you've been awful quiet. I'd like to, you do this for a living and you're excellent at it, but tell me, what's your thoughts about, I know Wally is correct. Obviously we want to protect our residents. We want to protect our, we want to make sure that Bee Cave Road is developed in a responsible manner. So where's our balance that we use on this, in your opinion, Meredith? Whoop, maybe you don't got it. Must have missed her. All right. Well, David, let me ask you, could you send me that, is there a way for me to get that overlay? And I will look at that and try to figure out how much setback we have currently, because I think that would be, how much setback we currently have based on the floodplain for those commercial properties on the south side of north side of Bee Cave Road.
And Tom, this is Meredith. I apologize. I had to step away from my phone for a second, but I'm here.
Sorry. Well, I was wondering, you deal with these guys that are redeveloping and looking at this stuff. What's your thoughts on where we're headed on this?
With regard to the setback conversation?
Setbacks, impervious cover. You deal with the City of Austin has impervious cover, Westlake's has impervious cover. We're actually probably in the middle of those two, or on the most liberal side of those two, if I'm not mistaken, when it comes to impervious cover.
I thought, and your point earlier about there's two different aspects of the impervious cover conversation. Is it to get water back into the dirt, or is it to preserve green space? And I think it's a little bit of both, but I also don't think that you're going to sneak up on anybody by having some sort of impervious cover or setback criteria. I mean, it's definitely standard. I like the conversation about reducing the Bee Cave frontage setback to bring the development walls closer to the street and make it a little safer. I think that's a great aspect. certainly the conversation about where the creek falls on your property and how does that affect your setbacks. Ryan, made a great point that if you've got creek running through your middle of your property, you really only have one property unless you want to get into the business of bridge building. And, none of our properties really are big enough to warrant something like that. But no, I think all of this conversation is really being well thought out. And there's nothing that we've talked about today that scares me or, gives me any concern. I think it's the beginning of a good conversation.
If you had a client that were looking at doing a development, let's assume for a second that development, it's one that we would like to have, that you would think you'd be good, well received by our citizens. And we had a 100-foot setback, but we said, okay, these are the criteria we use on a variance. And they took that, would that be a negative, or would most developers go that you deal with, would they go, okay, I can work with that. I know what the game plan, I know what the general game rules are. And something else may come up during the development process. We can't guarantee that, but that would be how would your customers feel about that?
Well, it all depends. I mean, when we're talking about development, it's by the cubic foot, it's not by the square foot, right? So it depends on, well, I'm going to do a smaller footprint. I'm going to move it closer to the street. We're eliminating parking lot, but can I get as high as I need to? Can I get to 3 stories instead of 2? Because I'm, either by right or by volunteer, reducing the footprint or whatever. It's just every project, every property is unique. And,
Sure.
I think if we can, I lean more towards the coming up with guidelines that are kind of, we would generally want it to look like this, but we're not going to make an absolute rule about this. Everything can kind of be considered. But no, the setbacks conversation, I think is totally fine.
Okay, right. So Ryan, let's, I like where we're headed about having a variance on the, and generally, I'll just tell you, and I'm not sure this will be spot zoning or not, because I think if you look at the issues that occur on the north side of BKs versus the south side, they're totally different. Because I think the properties are so much different on that. But if we wanted to set, let's think about the criteria we would use on a variance request, and to ensure we want to ensure the livability for our residents along the commercial corridor, the residential residents that live along the corridor. Lighting is certainly one that comes to my mind because I've dealt with it so many times. Height, I think we've agreed that we're not going to make a recommendation of over 2 stories on the north side of BKs. The south side does allow 3 stories if you are 150 feet away from any residential district, which most of them are given the width of BK's Road on that. So you probably could put a 3-story building on the south side of BK's Road. I won't misstate that before I finish on that. But if we did that, and we had some criteria for a setback issue, lighting would be one of mine. Certainly compliance with the drainage criteria manual, TCEQ, and the Edwards rules. And I don't know if we would have any other way we would be able to get that to comply. And actually redevelopment would probably improve both our water quality and our water quantity on BK's Road, because right now, all these developments don't have any of those requirements for the most part. So what else would we put as a criteria? The visual aspect of the building on the impact of our residents, that's kind of so general. I'm just not sure how that would fit in. Any thoughts on anybody here, Ryan or David or Brooke or Ron, Mo, or Meredith? Anything that we could put in there that we could start working on, looking at it from that standpoint?
This is Ryan. I think that instead of, I guess what I don't like the idea of encouraging variances. I like the idea of having a set of rules that makes sense based on the circumstances. That may sound like it's cutting things too thin, but I like the idea of going through the properties, taking a look to see how they impact neighbors, and then saying, because this one has no impact on neighbors, because there's no existing setback. I mean, I like what David said. Let's look at the existing current, it wouldn't be called a tech setback, but the current distance between the current building and the residences. It certainly doesn't make any sense to impose 100-foot setback on Wally if he's so close and it has no impact on them now. The only thing you're doing is preventing the property from being redeveloped. You're not actually helping anybody. Whereas there are some places where having a natural setback is a huge benefit, because there might be a property owner who is on this roughly the same level of the existing building, but having a 100-foot barrier or 50-foot barrier or 75-foot barrier is a benefit to the residences. And that's all I'm saying, is if we can somehow work through these things and identify places where maybe that existing setback serves no benefit to anybody, then we could recommend that it be eliminated or shortened.
That's actually what I was saying when I talked about the variant. I was going to try to get David's overlay and look at each of the properties so that I could actually do that. Now, let me ask y'all, what are y'all's feelings about the difference between the Rollingwood residential district and our neighbors to the south of us that are in a residential area that's in the city of Austin? Any thoughts on that?
I guess, Tom, is this what you're saying? Should we treat properties differently, whether or not they back up to a Rollingwood resident versus an Austin resident?
See, I think we do now, Brooke. That's what I'm really saying. I think that our ordinance says, and we've got really good attorneys here, you can have 3 stories if it is located at least 150 feet from any lot in a residential district. Now, a residential district, if you go to the definition, is defined as a Rollingwood defined residential area, not a city of Austin area. So I think I'm reading this correctly, and I think this is how this has been acted on over the last 50 years in Rollingwood. But we have had a good experience with our neighbors to the south of us that live in the city of Austin. And we've always tried to take their opinions into account on zoning requests and PUDs and everything else. They were very active in the Mara Vista PUD issue, for example, and supportive, I might add.
At Trader Joe's and not Randall's.
Yes, that's correct. But we took their opinions. We heard their opinions, and they're our neighbors, just like people on that are adjacent to our residential area. Although I am inclined to think that that we kind of look at that a little bit differently, though. I can't bring myself to say, gee, I'm going to have 100-foot setback on the residential areas, because none of them have it currently. They're all built right up to the lot line, because all our commercial development, with the exception of Mara Vista, occurred prior to the residential area behind it being developed. So
Yeah,
in
I
the
would
city
say-
of Austin area.
I would say, Tom, that they're all built up, not necessarily to the property line, they're all built up to the floodplain line.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking specifically of the residential housing that's in Tremont that abuts, some of their commercial development in.
Oh, you're talking about over there, yeah.
Yeah. But they're also built up to the lot line in certain areas on that. And we have commercial properties of the city of Austin that are built up to our areas in Rollingwood that are built on the lot line. Commercial properties in the city of Austin that are built within 10 feet of the lot line of the city of Rollingwood. So I'd have to look at that a little different, although I want to give them as much deference as I can, because they are neighbors and I don't want to cause them a great deal of harm, but I don't want it to be any worse than it is. But right now, at the very worst, it's 30 feet and not anymore. Many of these commercial properties are actually built right up to the lot line. So, and when I say built up, I'm not talking about the building, but remember our ordinance prohibits construction of a parking lot up to in that setback also. So I've got two, that's one question I would ask everybody to give a little thought to. The other one is, in any event, are we going to allow people to put a redevelopment to put any kind of water quality or water quantity improvements in that setback? City of Austin does allow that you can put that in a setback.
Is there any reason we wouldn't allow it?
The only reason, Ryan, my hesitation is I've seen some that just look like a big concrete bunker. And I think they look terrible. And I would a whole lot rather look at a parking lot than I would those big concrete bunkers that come out.
Well, and Tom, to an extent, you can be pretty prescriptive about the types of, that's a type of the concrete, basically they're basically sand sedimentation filtration boxes, essentially what you're talking about. You can basically, we could be more prescriptive and say, these are the types of water quality BMPs that are allowable in the setback. And,
Okay.
And these are the types that are not allowable in the setback.
David, I'm going to have to rely on you for that, because I've seen the ones I know the ones I like, I know the ones I don't like, but I don't know what they're called.
Yeah, I've got a laundry list of all those, and there's the technical manual for the TCQ Edwards rules kind of parses all of that out in really good form and fashion. And also there's going to be some of them that you're not going to want to use that close to the creek anyway. So
okay,
we can narrow in on the types, because I know of what you speak, and I agree with you. Like certainly that the one that TxDOT built that's right there next to Bee Caves Road, down there near the Endeavor project. That's not something that I'd want to necessarily have to have on the back of any of those any of those properties there, that where people would back up to and look onto it or into it, etc.
Great. Well, here's what I would like to do going forward. One, I'm going to try to get that overlay from you, David, and then we'll work on the wording for this other. But I'd like to have our next meeting, I'd like to have, if everybody's in agreement, I'd like to do it next Monday at this time so that we can continue this discussion, because I'd like to get this part of it finished up. And it sounds like to me we have two issues that are the biggest two issues. One is the impervious cover issues. The other is the rear setback and the criteria that we would use on the rules for that. And I think we can wrap that. I'd like to just concentrate on that the next meeting to get that kind of as wrapped up as we can. And I'm going to make sure that everybody gets that wants it. If y'all will let me know. Brooke, you said so. Ryan, I think you've got a copy, or you will get a copy, David. And anybody else that has said so can get a copy of the survey results, and we can kind of look at that. And
I haven't seen them. I would love to see them, and I would just encourage you to send them to the whole group. I think everybody would love to see them.
We can send it. It's a lot of pages, I'll just tell you, and it's a lot of reading. But if you're sending it electronically, I guess that it's not too bad. Ashley, you've got those electronically, I think.
I do, and I'm hoping that Bowie can get our most updated, the handwritten surveys that we've included.
Right.
So there has actually been some changes. So once I get that updated version from them, we can send that out.
Okay. Well, I would suggest just sending out what you have now, and then we'll kind of go from there. So do we have would everybody be able to meet next Monday to try to wrap this part of it, or wrap it up as much as we can? And then by next Monday, I will try to get the final schedule to get the rest of this pulled together, and I'll propose that to everybody at the next meeting if that works. So, and I do apologize. I was out of town and I did not get with Ashley to actually come up with all the dates yet, but I will. So We'll get that finished up. Anything else that anybody would like to bring up on this issue? And I'm not seeing any other business that we would like to bring up that I've kind of neglected. So not seeing that. So do we have anybody from the public that would like to make any comments? And again, I apologize. I meant to say anytime during this meeting, you're welcome to participate. And I'm not seeing any hands raised on that. So do we have a motion to adjourn? And we have a motion.
To adjourn.
And do we have a second? Thank you,
I'll
David.
second that motion.
There we go, Ron. And without objection, we are adjourned, and we will see y'all next Monday and hopefully get this thing, this part of it, this is really the guts of what we're doing. And I do appreciate everybody's comments and thoughts on that. And I'll throw some things out like that, and Brooke and David and everybody just jump out there and try to keep me in the traces if you can. If I get out of line, that's okay. Thank y'all very much, and we will see y'all next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.